Welcome to the Think Again workshop. This session is about Genesis 3:16, and we're going to do a deep dive using the doctoral dissertation by Joy Fleming. I'm Bruce C.E. Fleming, your instructor. We are happy to say that we're related to the website Tru316, Tru316.com, and also Genesis316.com. Well, we're so glad you're here. This is the dissertation we're going to be looking at. It's entitled A Rhetorical Analysis of Genesis 2-3 with Implications for a Theology of Man and Woman. We will be looking especially at chapter 3 from the dissertation. And if you have a copy with you, we'll actually be diving in at page 257. This doctoral dissertation was presented to the University of Strasbourg, France in 1987. And it's our desire to make sure that a brand new generation is able to look again at the insights that were found there. There are lots of thoughts going on, lots of theology, lots of folk theology circulating about the Garden of Eden. And it's not all correct. We're going to think about what it really does say and how we can know what it says. In her doctoral dissertation, she presented the big picture of Genesis chapters 2-3. We've drawn it as a bell curve, the beginning starting at chapter 2, verse 5, and working its way through chapter 3, verse 24. And the center of all of it is 2:25. They were in the Garden of Eden. They were naked and unashamed in the presence of the Lord. You see how we begin at the left side with Genesis 2:5, and we have an increase in complexity and goodness, and we continue for 1, 2, 3 different sections from verses 5 through 15. We call that A. Then verses 16 to 17, that's B. All this while God is at work. In section C, 18 to 24, and then we finally arrive up at D, 2:25. At that point, there is the attack. And we see sin at work, starting with 3:1 through 5. That's section C prime. And then B prime is 6 through 7, and A prime is 3, 8 to 24. One of the interesting things about a chiasm, that's what this is. Chi is the Greek letter, we call it X. And so in an X-shaped poetical passage like this that's tightly interwoven, we actually see mirror sections in the first part and in the prime part. So section A from 2:5 to 15 is going to be mirrored on purpose over an A prime. The question is, how is it mirrored? And one of the interesting things is that the way the structure is put together is intended also to give you meaning. It's a lot like a song. A song has lyrics, it's got the words, but a song also has melody. And the melody can add to the meaning of the lyrics. It could be a happy melody, we call it happy. It could be a sad melody, it could be in a minor key. Whatever it's using, what kind of percussion, what kind of rhythm it is, we can look at that and we can learn more about the words, what they mean, if the melody is correctly attached to the words. That's what happens when you get a bell curve like this. We can see there's a chiasm and there's an interrelation. Wow, we got things really going better. And oh, we got things really going worse. Well, there's rich insights found throughout all the 407 pages of this doctoral dissertation. And again, it's written so carefully that we can figure out what has been gotten off the track as far as theology about Genesis 2 and 3. You can see here on from page 238 of the dissertation, the careful analysis that's been done of the Hebrew. Remember, Hebrew reads from right to left. And so we have underlining, we have double underlining, we have circles, we have squares. All of this shows how these different sounds, even words, letters, are repeated as part of the poetical pattern. And if we don't take a look at this, well, it's a bit like this illustration. What happens if you have an accident on the road? One car rear ends another car, and eventually you go to court, and the judge tries to decide, well, what did happen out there on the road? Well, there were the drivers of each car. So you have one story from the one and one story from the other. And then there were people around, maybe three others. And you can end up with 5 different stories of what really happened. What really happened? Quite often the authorities will go back and double check. They will actually try to reconstruct the accident. They will look at the skid marks. How long was the skid mark? How dark was the skid mark? They will look at the equipment. They will try to figure out, is there any kind of a record that's been left? Who turned what? Were the wheels actually turned? Where were the cars impacted? Where were they in the middle of the intersection? They'll measure. They'll actually get numbers. They'll get these details. And it's the combination of the details as well as the stories that gives us the best chance of seeing what happened back then. Well, how do we measure a Bible passage? We'll see those tools illustrated as we go through the dissertation here. But in our Think Again study, we've talked about 6 different steps. One is to think again about the context of the passage. You have to even decide, what passage am I studying? In this situation, we're talking about the last part of Genesis 3. And the context of the passage is the larger section of the bell curve. So if we understand what's happening in the bell curve, the good news, and then the bad news of the bell curve, that helps us understand. We also have to understand the content of the passage. Well, what is the passage? Again, the immediate context in this sense, when God speaks to the woman in Genesis 3:16, is the speech to the serpent just before that in 14 and 15. And then immediately after that, when God speaks to the man in verses 17 to 19. We want to think again about the key image or ideas in the passage, and there are several that we're going to follow up. We want to think again about the target verse. In this case, it's what did God say to the woman? We want to think again about the points of application. All right, so we see this and we learn it, but how do we apply it to our lives? And then number 6, we want to think again about what the passage does not say. And that means we come to the passage with presuppositions. We think we know what the passage says. And sometimes we're so anxious to put our meaning into the text that we don't pay a whole lot of attention to what the text says, especially when the text does not support what we're saying, or even says, no, what we're saying is actually against the meaning of the passage. We have to focus. We have to think carefully. That's where the measurements come in. Well, I'm going to leave off showing the on-screen PowerPoint presentation in a second. And we'll actually look and start reading from the pages of the dissertation. If you have the PDF, it'd be good to pull it up, or if you've printed it out, you can follow along, mark it up. And I've also done audio recordings of key sections of the dissertation. Anybody subscribed to Tru316.com Think Again Workshop should have these materials. If you don't have them, you can contact me, Bruce at Tru316.com. All right, we're going to move to the dissertation, and we'll start with page 257. I'm going to stop the share and stop sharing this and start sharing the pages of the dissertation. There we go. I have them on my screen. I hope it works on yours. You'll notice the second speech. It's in the middle of the page. But before we get to that, I want to show you the tail end of what's been up above. Joy has been talking about what happened in, in God's words to the serpent and to the man. And we have a punishment that comes in the form of a curse. We have instruction to the man when he talks about what else is going on, the fact that he's already now mortal, and how that'll turn out. And so we have here a chiasm just in the words to the man. That often happens. You have a chiasm within a chiasm within a chiasm. That's part of the genius of Hebrew poetry. It helped them to remember the poetry and to pass it on orally as well. We have a lightly outlined box and a darkly outlined box, these two going together in section A. And we have 2 words down in A prime, and light and dark. The meaning of the light and dark, Dr. Fleming looked at this and she said, you know, this is good news and this is the bad news. Then she saw, well, B and B prime also has good news and bad news, good news and bad news. And C has good news and bad news. So as she looked at the immediate verses surrounding Genesis 3:16, she began to see a good, bad pattern in those verses. Actually, in the verses to the serpent and to the man, we have a multi-part, detailed, repeated pattern, as God said to the serpent and to the man, because you have done this, cursed is the object of your activity and all the days of your life. And there were even words that sounded the same, shuf and shuv. All of these things made a pattern, and they made a good bad pattern. All right, with that insight, we're going to move to the second speech. And I'll be reading the words from page 257. The speech to the woman has a structure of its own. Good and bad are juxtaposed as God instructs her, so that she may know how good and evil will be a part of her life from now on. The first 7 words in the speech will be analyzed first, and for the sake of clarity, labeled as follows. Word group number 1, harpa arba. Word group number 2, itzabonek waheranek. And word group number 3, be'etzev teildi banim. I won't be going into the Hebrew very much here. They'll be on the screen or in the PDF. You can look at that more yourself. Each of these word groups will be analyzed in turn, then the structure will be explained. God had blessed the couple when he created them. This is stated in the previous and in the following Toledot sections before and after the bell curve in Genesis 1:28 and 5:2. Both the woman and the man had been created in God's image and likeness and blessed by God. They had been instructed by God to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living thing that moves on the earth. God does not rescind this blessing given to the woman and the man at the time of their creation. Though he levies a curse on the serpent and a curse because of the man, he begins his speech to the woman with words of blessing. That's word group number 1. Harba arba is a grammatical construction in which the infinitive absolute of the verb is followed by the imperfect form of the same verb. This construction occurred twice in the command God gave in 2:16 and 17. Since then, the woman and the man had violated God's command by eating of the one tree. They would each face death. The woman, addressed after the serpent and before the man, may have expected to hear God speak to her about death. Instead, he speaks to her about life. The grammatical construction we noted in episode B with the verb, in 3:16, that grammatical construction with the verb rabah occurs in the hifil tense and in the first person. The verb rabah in the hifil means to make much, many, great. Then the expression appears 3 times in the Old Testament. Each time it's in a message from Yahweh. Besides its occurrence here, it's found in Genesis 16:10, where these words are spoken to Hagar, and it occurs in Genesis 22:17 when Abraham is addressed. God promises Hagar that he will greatly multiply her seed, the Hebrew word is zerah, which will be so numerous as to be uncountable. The same expression is part of the address to Abraham in Genesis 22:16 to 18. Because of Abraham's act and of not withholding his son, his one unique son, God will bless Abraham and greatly multiply his seed, zerah, which will possess the gate of his enemies. And in his seed, all nations of the earth will receive blessing because Abraham heeded God's voice. As in Genesis 1:28, blessing and multiplied offspring are juxtaposed. For Abraham, God commits himself to greatly bless him and to greatly multiply his seed. For the first man and woman at the time of their creation, God had blessed them both. He had also told them to multiply. God's first 2 words to the woman in 3:16 sound a note of hope. For while he had already blessed them both, he now commits himself to greatly multiply the woman's offspring. The original blessing is not abrogated despite her transgression, and in the place of the mandate he had given them to multiply and fill the earth, he now adds his own new engagement to greatly multiply. That's the first 2 words. In word group number 2, one expects to find the word sarah, seed, going to greatly multiply your seed. This would complete the thought, as in Genesis 16 and 22. And after that, one might expect to find God saying that her seed would be as numerous as the stars of the sand, or too numerous to count. Those who got to be very familiar with Genesis would have known what about what about Hagar and what about Abraham God had said. And they would know that whenever we hear multiply, I will multiply, we're going to get seed, we're going to get lots of children. That would be the expected follow-up of 3:16. However, that's not what we have. We have a group of words instead of just one word. They complete the thought, but it employs two words. So it begins a lesson on two things, and with two, we have the possibility, and we have it here, of good and evil. God is instructing her, and she's learning to know about good and evil. Word group number 2 then contains not one, but two nouns. These two words are joined by the conjunction and. Some people point out that when you have two words with an and, you can come up with a hendiadys in the Hebrew language. Well, yeah, that's true. Grammatically, you have often have some parts that signal the fact that we're supposed to take these two words and make one out of them. And so modern translations in the last couple hundred years have started taking these two words in the Hebrew, and they've decided to say, well, this is actually one. And they squeeze these two words together, and they come up with a brand new word. But a hendiadys is not required here. Number one instead is distributed to the two parts of word group number 2. And so we're going to learn some meaning. What the passage does not say, then, she's arguing, is it does not say there's this one big new bad thing that God is multiplying. So let's pay attention. What are the two things that God multiplies? Reading from page 261. The first noun, itzabon, is the first word of the sad news in 3:16. This itzabon is a foreign element to the world and people who were created good by God. The second noun of word group number 2 completes the thought of multiplied offspring, good news for the woman and associated with blessing. Word group number 2 contains bad, itzabon, followed by good, heron. It is bittersweet, which characterizes what life will now be like according to God, who teaches her so that she may know how good and evil will impinge on her life from now on. Word group number 2 resembles some other groups nearby, but the main idea is to realize that in this case, form conveys content. Form conveys content. That's that melody, that's the lyrics, that's the poetry put together. What are we going to learn from the form? Well, she will acquire multiplied knowledge of not just good as before, but now bad too. And good and bad are put in quotes. We've got a negative and a positive element here. Neither of the two nouns in word group number 2 is seed, as we could have expected, but the second of the two is related in meaning, conception or pregnancy. So heron, the second word, can be easily translated pregnancy. I will greatly multiply your pregnancy. Or conception. I will greatly multiply your conception. Okay, what does this passage not say? Well, people who put together the two words and come up with a hendiadys think that God is talking about, I will greatly multiply something in relation to her act of childbirth. But conception is 9 months earlier than childbirth. So let's keep looking at these details. I think we're finding more about what the passage does not say, as well as what it says. The word chosen instead of seed completes the thought of word group 1 at the same time that it provides an instance of paronomasia with word group number 1. So we've got sounds fitting together, and you can use seed, you can use conception. In this case, the word conception was used. The expected word zerah does occur in the passage, though it's not in verse 16. God used it in the speech to the serpent rather than in his speech to her, just a few words earlier. God speaks, though, there of not one, but two. So we're seeing this pattern. We don't have one thing. We have two things. We have a bad seed and a good seed who will be enemies and fight against one another. The second word in word group number 2, speaking of her offspring, then, her heron, is preceded by its earlier announcement in verse 15. And we have a nifty little illustration here. We have the Hebrew words, itzabon and heron, and then we have an arrow pointing back to 3:15 with the word zerah. What about the first word? Well, the first of the two nouns in word group number 2, and that's pronounced itzabon, refers proleptically to the itzabon of verse 17. When my wife first pointed this out to me, she said, this is a proleptic prophecy. I have to confess I didn't remember what that was, if I even learned it when I was in seminary. So I asked her, well, what's a proleptic prophecy? And she smiled and she said, well, it's a prophecy where the results of what's going to happen are given, but how those results came to be is not given in detail yet. or not even hinted at. So we don't know why she's going to have Itzabone. We know that she's going to have Itzabone. And then when you get to verse 17, we found out why. Not only did she have it, but also the man has it. So this word Itzabone is not sex-related or gender-related or restricted. And we see that in 529. We've got some parents that are talking about their son Noah, and they're saying, maybe this child will save us from the Itzabone that we have. However, God did, or rather will, curse the ground from which the man had come. This would result in Itzabone for the man. The man was going to eat what the ground produced as food, but he was going to eat of it in Itzabone, in toil or sorrow. I think the best translation for us to be following here is a hyphenated word, sorrowful-toil. So in sorrowful toil, you will eat of it. He says to the woman, I will multiply your sorrowful toil. She doesn't know why, but she's interested in finding out what that's going to mean. So the woman, too, whose food was the same as the man, would experience this sorrowful toil as well in order to eat what the ground produced. In fact, the two eaters from the same forbidden tree would both experience the same. So the word Itzabone is kind of a pun. The beginning is itz, and the word for tree in Hebrew is eitz. And so there's this cute sound. Those tree eaters are going to be eating of sorrowful toil as they now wrest the food they need from the ground. Here's a good diagram. We have the word from 317, Itzabone, coming back up and influencing word group number 2 at the beginning of 316, Itzabone. And we have the word zerah coming down. The words are going to describe that as we get there. Page 263, episode A prime part 2 contains the 3 speeches to the serpent, the woman, and the man. The center speech, 316, contains the linchpin of 314 to 19. The 2 words of word group number 2 in 316 function similarly to the 2 words noted in 2:8 in the center of episode A, which pointed to a word in the preceding verse and pointed to a word in the succeeding verse. In 2:8, we've got one pointing up to 2:9, and in 2:8, we have one pointing back to 2:7. This was a discovery of Isaac Kikuwata when he looked at Genesis chapter 11 and saw a linchpin there. He recommended, oh yeah, there's also one in 2:8. And from that discovery, Dr. Joy Fleming said, well, wait, we have these mirror sections in A and A prime. Is there a linchpin in A prime? And she found it right here in 316. The curse on the ground because of the man will modify the cultivation of the ground such that she, like the man, will experience toil in order to eat from it. God's curse of the ground will negatively impact her life, but God will multiply her offspring. That's the other word. This is a promise of blessing, and her seed will also fight against her enemy whom God has cursed. We come to word group number 3, and it doesn't speak of curses, nor does it speak of impingement of any curses on her as word group 2 did. It's not a blessing per se either. It does, however, pick up the themes of word group 1, the words associated with blessing, and the end of 2, conception, which completed that thought, and it speaks about bearing children. Word group number 3 comments on implications of multiplied pregnancies, bearing children in pain. The word pain there is not restricted to childbirth. In fact, it's used other times in the Old Testament, and no other time does it even hint at the idea of childbirth. It's basically talking about using different muscles in such a way that you're going to have a lot of effort, and it's going to result perhaps even in pain. It bears reminding that God nowhere curses the bodies of the man or the woman. The only curses in the story are in verse 14 and verse 17, where the serpent and the ground are cursed. And neither of those curses is because of the woman. However, the curse levied on the ground will impact the man and the woman. Also involving the woman is the fact that her enemy is the cursed serpent. Yet her seed will fight and overpower him. God does not curse the woman in word group number 3. We're going to keep stressing that. Or anywhere in the speech addressed to her. See? If anything, he blesses her, for word groups number 1 and 2 speak of multiplied pregnancies. She has, however, by her own choice, elected to die. In the day you eat thereof, you will die. In the moment that they ate thereof, they became, walking dead people. They were mortal. They were spiritually separated from God, and their bodies were dying. God does not need to curse her or the man for her or him to have a death body. This was the choice each of the humans made when they disobeyed God's command. Death was the consequence God had already announced and never reiterates. Once he'd used the word death in 2:17, it is thereafter presumed, and he never uses the word again. Even in verse 19, he does not restate the death penalty when he describes what will become of the man's death body. You will go back to dust. Word group number 3, like the last 2 lines in the speech to the man, describe a death body. He explains to her what her death body will experience at the very time it brings new life into the world. Childbirth. What could have been multiplied blessing in a world of pure good? Think about that. Childbirth for Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, before the attack, before the entry of death, she was going to have lots of children. And it wasn't a curse. It wasn't a bad thing. This childbirth was going to be great. But now that they're mortal, it's going to be different. The first word of word group number 3 is bad, quote unquote. And the 2 following words, speaking of bearing children, quote unquote, are good. Itzabone in word group 2 was inserted into the otherwise pure good of word groups 1 and 2. And here now in word group number 3, etzev is interjected into what would otherwise be pure good in word group number 3. God had said that he would multiply not only her offspring in word group 2, but also, well, in a sense, her etzev. The noun itzabone comes from the word asav, the root verb, which means to labor, to toil, to pain. Without God's act of cursing the ground, which will result in itzabone, the woman already has a death body which will give birth in etzev, an asav-related word. The itzabone will truly increase her etzev. She will not have 1, but 2 problems in the way of asav. The death body she already has will bring forth children, etzev, in hardship and pain. But also God's act of cursing the ground will cause itzabone, her sorrowful toil. The intensified construction of Rabbah to become much, many, great, multiplying I will multiply, is graphically portrayed that way then in the multiplied occurrences of Asav in word group 2 and in word group 3, in the Itzabon and the Etzev. God's multiplying of her offspring resulted in good, even blessing, but why would he multiply her Asav? She already had a death body which would give birth to children. Why Itzabon in addition? The man and the woman both ate of the forbidden Eitz tree. But the woman herself not only ate, excuse me, but influenced her husband to do so likewise. But influenced her husband to do likewise. Though she was misled by the serpent and the man guarding the guardian was at fault in his duties, she nonetheless transgressed and influenced another person to transgress as well. Thus, the curse of the ground to punish his knowing disobedience will influence her existence as she eats food from the same cursed ground. Elsewhere in the dissertation, we have the discussion that there's different kinds of sin in the Old Testament. There were people who murdered, and that could be called first-degree murder or intentional or willful murder, and they received a very harsh, the harshest of penalties, the death penalty. But there were people who committed manslaughter or not willful murder, and they were given a chance to flee to the villages of refuge where they could live and not be put to death for their crime, because they were second-degree murderers. So God shows that later on. We have clear indication of, in many places throughout the Bible, of first-degree or second-degree sin. And in the case of the man who ate and he wasn't deceived, and the woman who ate, but Satan had to deceive her before she would even eat. She had defended God. She had instructed the serpent, corrected the serpent, and yet the serpent continued to attack her and attack her and attack her and finally deceived her. And only then did she offer the fruit to the man. Only then did she take it herself and eat it. So we have instead now, we have 2 degrees of sin. We have the man who sinned willfully. That's actually first-degree rebellion. And then we have the woman who sinned through deception. Now that's second-degree deception. So we have first-degree sinner and a second-degree sinner. The first-degree rebels, the serpent and the man, each had curses pronounced because of them. A lot of people just kind of bounce along and they think, well, we've got 3 speeches, we've got 3 curses or more. A lot of people think that there were lots of curses. In fact, when we've polled people in 3 different continents, they've said, well, there's at least 4 curses. God cursed the man and the woman and the serpent and the dirt. And we have to gently correct them and say, no, he only cursed twice. He didn't curse either human being at all. It's a wonderful, loving God. He's just created them. The whole place is for them. And they've rebelled, but he's so gentle and so loving. And we have to understand that in Genesis 3:16. Well, there are 2 good words following etziv then in word group number 2. And they make it clear that he's going to bless her with these children. And when he's talking about giving birth to children, the blessed aspect of that is emphasized as much as possible. To bear, to bring forth, to beget, that verb occurs frequently in the Old Testament. Its next occurrence is, now I'm picking up again on page 266 from the dissertation. Its next occurrence is in Genesis 4:1, and it occurs again in 4:2. These 2 verses record the birth of Eve's first 2 sons. Since the woman has never had a death body, and she will soon experience childbirth with that death body, God instructs her what it will be like in a world of bad and good. He explains that giving birth will involve hardship, effort, and even pain. She does not know this, and might otherwise think that death is upon her when the pain of childbirth comes, so that she may understand that pain in bearing children is a part of life with a death body in a world of good and bad. God instructs the woman in word group number 3 regarding the most immediate and important personal consequence accruing from the fact that she now has a death body. What it will feel like. Well, we see here that in the diagram in the middle of the page that we have another chiasm. Parts A, B, C, B prime, and A prime. And we have lightly outlined and darkly outlined elements. We have the good, the bad, the good, the bad, and the good. A, C, and A prime have to do with her offspring and are quote unquote good. God will bless her with multiplied offspring. B and B prime are the bad elements intruding on her life in a world which is now good and bad. A and A prime are each 2 words. We're seeing the pattern, the details, the closely linked description and construction of the pattern of the chiasm. Page 267. The last 4 words of verse 16 concern the relationship between the one flesh partners, the woman and the man. So God's moving on to that part of her life. Thematically, the first 4 words of verse 16, words group 1 and 2, concerned God's action upon her life. He doesn't act on her in the rest of the verse, but he did in the first 2 word groups. The next 3 words in word group number 3 describe what the experience of life with her death body would be like. The final 4 words in 16b describe what life will be like with her partner in a world and with people which are now good and evil. The 4 words are labeled A, B, C, and D, and we have a little diagram of that. There is a suggestion of symmetry in these 4 words. The first 2 words seem parallel to the last 2 words in a way reminiscent of what we saw at the end of 3:15. In 3:15, the structure was parallel. There were 2 sets of 3 words. Each set there followed the same pattern, pronoun plus imperfect form of the verb shuf, plus a noun, a body part. The structure suggested what word meaning explained. There would be 2 opposing sides, one good, one bad. They would each attack the other, using the verb shuf. The body parts wounded, the head and heel, different and opposite, portrayed the result of the action of shuf in each case. The apparent parallel symmetry of 3:16b breaks down under more careful scrutiny. So people think we've got something. We've got, oh yeah, he talks to God about her, your desire is, and he talks to him about the man, to rule. No, there's not really parallel symmetry here. Beyond a symmetry of 2 words plus 2 words, it is difficult to find any parallel. Word C begins the second pair of words with a pronoun, like the who of verse, that's the Hebrew word, who of verse 15. But there is no single pronoun corresponding to it. D contains a verb with the Hebrew letter that sounds like sh, but it's not a shu verb. And more surprisingly, there's no corresponding verb elsewhere at all in these 4 words. Could 16b be a chiastic structure, resembling the chiasm of the last 2 lines of verse 19? Well, let's look into that. A begins with the preposition to, indicating direction, and a makaf, that little dash in the Hebrew there. Like the two L terms in the chiastic structure of verse 19. And D seems to correspond somewhat to C as it ends with a makaf and a preposition. However, the preposition beginning word A and the preposition ending word D do not correspond, though it almost seems like they should. So we can see why people would think that they should, even reading in Hebrew, they think that these things should be parallel, but they don't correspond. Furthermore, the preposition of A is joined to a noun that has a pronominal suffix, whereas the preposition of D has a pronominal suffix and is joined to a verb. B looks like it might provide the lost shu verb, but it's neither a verb nor is it reciprocated by a corresponding noun or verb composed of shuk. The last half of the chiasm in verse 19, let's look there. That might provide some help in understanding the pattern to the structure of 16b. It's made up of 4 words. 2 of the words are prepositions with a makaf. 1 word is a pronoun alone. The 4th word is a verb, the only verb to be found in 19c. The structure of 19c may come closest to the unusual 4 words of 16b, but the structure of 19c is much more clearly ordered than that of 16b. Verse 19c bears a much closer resemblance to 15c than does 16b. And as I mentioned, we have a complete detailed pattern that's repeated both to the serpent and to the man. And that's clear here at the end of verse 19. Verse 19c does not follow a pattern which repeats as perfectly as 15c, yet there are some significant parallels between the first 2 words and the last 2 words of verse 19c. The first and third words are each comprised of a preposition joined by a makaf to the same noun, and the second and fourth words are not parallel. One's a pronoun, one's a verb, yet both are second masculine singular. All right. The structure of the 3 words plus 3 words in 15c was parallel. The 2 words plus 2 words in 19c contained parallel elements. In both cases, the 2 sets of words were joined by and in the middle. In 316b, 2 occurrences of and in word A and in C seem to force the 4 words into a parallel structure. No. This structure actually resists all other attempts to force the 2 lines into a symmetrical structure at all. One searches in vain to find that. Grammatically, in 316b, lines 1 and 2 are not related other than by the formal connection of the 2 ands. Line 1 is comprised of a preposition linked to a noun with a pronominal suffix and a noun with a pronominal suffix. Line 2 is made up of a pronoun and a verb linked to preposition with pronominal suffix. In English, we'd do it this way. We've got the first word in line 1, and to man your. We've got the second word, desire your. And in line 2, we've got the word and he. And then we have, now, and this is just one Hebrew word with 4 English words used to translate it, will rule over you. The first line begins with a preposition and a noun, to ish, to the man. But the second line begins with a pronoun, he. Thus, man, he opens each line at the end here of 316. Each line ends with the woman mentioned with a pronominal suffix. In the first line, there are 2 nouns but no verb. In the other line, there's 1 verb but no nouns. These just don't fit together. The sh sound is present in both lines, but it's not like the chiastic structure of 19b and c, which begin and end with the word shuv, shuv. Nor is it like the parallel construction of 15, C and D, which had shuf as the second of 3 words in each part. Remember, form communicates content. What are we learning as we look at this form? 2 lovers come from a good world. Created one from the other and related intimately each to the other, they are still yoked together in matrimony, but will experience the tension of good and evil in their lives together. The dominant position that the man will assume is hinted at by his prominent place in the syntax. Man, he, opens each line in Hebrew. The woman's presence in the syntax becomes almost a subliminal footnote, pronominal suffixes at the end of each line. The force, so her. The force symmetry of 15 or 16b, the and, etc., highlights the unparalleled nature of these 2 lines. 2 prepositions appear. They're found at the beginning and end. What are they? Well, to and over. To, over. Well, they are unreciprocal. We don't get to. We don't get over, under. To and over are incompatible. The to structure begun in word A, but not carried through in line 2, would be an appropriate description of mutual love. To. The over-under structure, found one-sidedly only in word D, would be an appropriate description of the relationship between God and humans, or an appropriate description of the relationship between humans and animals. It would be desirable in the case where good should triumph over evil, as in her seed is going to triumph over the serpent in 3:15. There, God had established enmity between the deceiving serpent and the woman. But an over-under structure is not appropriate and would deform the relationship of the one flesh partners. The husband was to cling to his wife, just as Ruth clung to Naomi. That's from Genesis 2. Words C and D show instead an enemy and combative stance toward the woman. We see attack and domination shown in 3:15C. It's appropriate there, but we see it now in 16. The resemblance between line 2 of 3:16B and 3:15C suggests that the man will relate to her as in an adversary relationship, assuming an enemy posture. The end of the speech to the serpent introduced the subject of the woman before she herself was addressed in the second speech. Likewise, the subject of the man is introduced already in the second speech before he is addressed in verse 17. In this way, there is a similarity between the first and second speeches. But a significant difference is that in 3:15, God establishes the serpent's enmity with the woman. The conflict there is something God says, I will put enmity between the two of you. He says, I will do it. In 3:16, he doesn't say, I will do anything. The woman instead is warned that the man will assume the stance of an enemy. Here, God neither speaks in the first person, as in 3:15, to establish such enmity, nor does he address the man to instruct him, you assume this posture over her. Doesn't say that. He warns the woman of what her husband, now fallen, will be like in relation to her. In the past, she'd experienced the loyalty from her husband in a world of good only. She seems to be still anticipating and prepared for such a relationship with her husband. That's the word teshuka. We don't focus on that very much in the dissertation. A lot of people get hung up with this word desire. I don't think we need to worry about that too much. Desire is a good thing. Desire, means love. Now the man tainted as evil is tainted by evil, and as his next actions will demonstrate, he will seek to extricate himself from the relationship he had with his one flesh partner. Why? Page 272. He'd already accused her and God. Don't we learn by observing that? 3:12. In the place of the relationship he had, he will set himself up as her new ruler. New ruler? Well, that's a task and a place of honor only appropriate for God. Only God is worthy of her allegiance. Only God would be worthy of being her ruler, or his. Her partner created good by God, who, having chosen to rebel, was now a rival of God and would seek to usurp the place of God in her life. If allowed or accepted by her, this would in effect be a tacit form of idolatry. It's not right for her to say, oh yeah, you can rule over me. Who should rule over her? God only, God alone. This is a great insight from the dissertation. I'll reread this paragraph. Her partner created good, quote unquote, by God, but who, having chosen to rebel, was now a rival of God and would seek to usurp the place of God in her life. If allowed or accepted by her, this would in effect be a tacit form of idolatry, quote unquote. Well, think again about this. Her teshuka is toward him, presumably as if before. They're lovers in the Garden of Eden. Of course, they both desire each other, but he will not reciprocate. Now we get into the details. Teshuka is not a noun applied uniquely in the Old Testament to women. It's applied to a man in Song of Solomon 7:11, where Solomon's desire, teshuka, is for his lover. She says, his desire is upon me. Nor is teshuka a noun which is necessarily sexual in character, as in its use in the story of Cain and Abel in Genesis 4. Okay, let's leave this text for a second and think about what does the passage not say. In the late in the late 20th century, I'm thinking of the 1970s, I think it was, Susan Foh, F-O-H, wrote a lot and advocated that the word itzabon is used in Genesis 4. And there it's talking about sin desires like an animal to eat up Cain. And God warns him, look out, don't let him do that. And so that's the use of the word teshuka. She said, we know what teshuka for the woman means because we know what teshuka means in the sense of sin and Cain. It's a nasty animal. It's trying to master Cain, to get him to do wrong. It desires teshuka. It desires Cain. Well, now we know what desire means. And then she says, we take that meaning from Genesis 4 and we see it in Genesis 3. She desires her husband. Well, we saw in the bell curve that Genesis chapter 4 isn't part of the bell curve. If we want to know what happened in Genesis 3:16, we can find out from what happened in the other words before and after it in Genesis 3:14 to 15 or in 17:19, God's words to the serpent, God's words to the man, not God's words to Cain. God's words to Cain are in a different section. And if she's going to be saying, oh, this is important, well, it just doesn't say that. We don't have her saying, oh, your desire. Other people have gotten worried about the word desire, and they've said, well, she's desiring to be God to the man. Well, there's lots written on the word desire. If you look up Genesis 3:16, everybody worries about the word desire, teshuka. I don't think we're actually seeing the right thing at all here. The big thing about Genesis 3:16 is that he completes the promise of the conquering seed that's going to crush the head of Satan. The big conflict in Genesis chapter 3 is the attack and their death and finally being driven out of the Garden of Eden. We're not talking about the desire. The big conflict is completed in God's words to her. He says, I'm going to multiply. For sure, you're going to have conception. Of who? Of the promised one that's going to crush Satan's head. That's what we should pay attention to in Genesis 3:16. It's the new thing that God says in 3:16. I'm going to give new things. Yeah, there's going to be the curse on the ground and you're going to have itzabon. But yes, there is the coming conception. You're going to have that. Back to the chapter of the dissertation in 272. In Genesis 3:16, though the woman's desire is to her man, yet he will not reciprocate with any kind of desire like that. Since their disobedience, harmony of the two has been broken. And the Hebrew word that applies to the man here, mashal, means to rule, have dominion over, to reign. God's words are not prescriptive. God never instructs the man to act in such a way. The mandate, the rule he gave them in 128 was to rule over the animals. God's words are descriptive here of the broken harmony, for the man is about to reign over her. Phyllis Tribble describes it in this way, and we have a long quote of her. At the point of disobedience, distinctions within one flesh became oppositions. Division followed, yielding opposite sexes. To defend himself against God, the man, Ha-Adam, turned against the woman and betrayed her to God, 3:12. Yet according to God, she still yearns for the original unity of male and female. For your man, Ish, is your desire, teshuka. Alas, however, union is no more. One flesh is split. The man will not reciprocate the woman's desire. Instead, he will rule over her. Thus, she lives in unresolved tension. Where once there was mutuality, now there's hierarchy of division. The man dominates the woman to pervert sexuality. Hence, the woman is corrupted in becoming a slave, and the man is corrupted in becoming a master. His supremacy is neither a divine right nor a male prerogative. Her subordination is neither a divine decree nor the female destiny. Both their positions result from shared disobedience. God describes this consequence, but does not prescribe it as punishment. Now, we're going to think again about the content by learning about the context. What's the context? Well, we have episode A prime, part 3, Out of Eden, 3:20 to 24. This part of our session is a bonus. We don't have to go into this, but I think you'll get a good contrast and learn more about the content of 316 by seeing what happens outside of it. So I'm reading now from pages 273 on. Verses 320 to 24 form a unit, the third and final part of episode A prime. Like part 1 of A prime, which was back in chapter 3, verses 8 to 13. The characters include the man, the woman, and Yahweh Elohim. God's speeches to the guilty parties ended with the verse 19. The last unit of the Garden of Eden story begins with the next verse, verse 20, and continues through verse 24. After that, in Genesis 4:1, a new period of life will begin for the man and the woman outside of Eden. And then we have a great diagram of the Hebrew text of these verses on page 274. You can take a screenshot of that and study it in greater detail. We're going to work our way through it, though, with the words now on page 274. Verses 320 and 24 contain the three divine names. Yahweh Elohim is found in verse 21, 22, and 23, where it's the second word following a verb of each verse. The action of part 3 and the structure centers around Yahweh Elohim, who made, said, and sent in verses 21, 22, and 23. In the first and third cases, God acts. The second and center occurrence of the divine name is followed only by the words of Yahweh Elohim in these verses. The woman and the man are the other characters of part 3. Yahweh, well, we've got a lot of words pointed out, how they occur, what they do. We have an expectation of one thing finally delayed, and we get to them. The following chiasm delineates the structure of these verses. A, B, C, B prime, A prime. A, the man names the woman. B, Yahweh Elohim clothes the man and the woman. C, Yahweh Elohim speaks. B prime, verse 23, Yahweh Elohim sends him out. And verse 24, A prime, the man is banished. Each new section opens with a Hebrew verb plus noun. The noun could be either Yahweh Elohim or the man. In sections A and A prime, the man acts and is acted upon, respectively. In sections B and B prime, Yahweh Elohim acts. In section C, Yahweh Elohim speaks. The longer prime sections emphasize the import and finality of the momentous event of the man's banishment from Eden. The contrast is to be noted between the end of episode A, the big A back in the bell curve, 2:15, when God led the man into the garden, and the end of episode A prime, when God drives the man out. Recapitulation and linear progression are used appropriately to close the story. Previous episodes are alluded to by choice of vocabulary and paronomasia. This is true in each of the 5 verses. The man names the woman, 3:20, as he named the animals in 2:19 and 20. God graciously clothes both the man and the woman, 3:21, though they at one time had been naked and not ashamed, 2:25. God's words of 3:22 allude to the following: the 2 trees he had made, 2:9, the serpent's terminology when he promised, 3:5, that they would know good and evil, and the act of eating committed committed in episode B prime and forbidden in episode B. In 3:23, the man is sent out of the garden and back to the ground he was taken from. And that makes us think of episodes A and A prime. The guardian of the garden, 2:15, is banished. And the tree of life is guarded in 3:24. And now comes a look even in greater detail. In 3:20, the naming formula from 2:19 to 20 is used. The man names his wife, Kara Shem, giving her the name Eve. The naming formula with this verb Kara and the noun Shem was used when he gave names to the various animals. And elsewhere, she says this is like the, an official naming formula we'd hear in England, where the Queen says, "I now dub you Sir such and such." And when you do that, it's clear we've got a royal who is bestowing a special name upon so-and-so. Well, we've got that here, Kara Shem. In Genesis 2, we have a legitimate naming process as he dubbed the names of each of the animals and fulfilled the task entrusted to him by God. He had discovered in the process that the one who would be his partner and undertake such tasks with him as a partner, the Ezer Kenegdo of which he was in need, could not be found. Earlier, we discovered what Ezer Kenegdo meant Ezer was a help. Kenegdo meant face to face. Ezer was a word used mostly for God, other places in the Old Testament. In Psalm, 121, I lift up my eyes to the hills. I look at the idols on these various hills. Is that where my help comes from? From those places in the hills? As I'm going up to Jerusalem to worship the one true God? My help comes from God, maker of heaven and earth. No, that's Ezer. God is the help. From his excess strength, he comes to help. And several other times Ezer is used, but it's of one royal coming to help another royal. So they're partnering. Well, which way is the woman supposed to be Ezer? Is she over or side by side? Well, it says kenegdo, which means face to face. Okay, she's not like God, but she is face to face. And we see other places then that she's like another royal coming to help this royal. No place does Ezer ever have the meaning of an inferior. The English word, I maybe even think the Latin might have it too, have an inferior sense. When John Calvin came upon the word Ezer, he said in his commentary on Genesis chapter 2 that the woman is like a cook's helper. He did it wrong. But the influence of John Calvin has been strong ever since, and in churches and in theology and in hymns and in sermons today. And that needs to be cleaned out. So the man had discovered that she was an Ezer Kenegdo. He had good theology. He knew that she was his partner. He was her partner. When he saw the woman for the first time, picking up again in 276, he had exclaimed in joy in 223. It was a poetic burst of relief and joy, the way it was put together in the text. He recognized the oneness of essence of the other human being with himself. But now the music changes. Da 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 da. We've got a minor tone. In 320, after the act of disobedience, he presumes to confer on her a name, and the naming formula is used. Kara, Shem, I-W. This describes how he gives her a proper name. God had never told either one of the two human beings to name the other. God was quite happy with the name he had given them. We find in Genesis chapter 5 and 2 that God had named them both Adam. We could say they were Mr. and Mrs. Adam. And we have the parasonancy of the verbs all throughout here. We have all these things as God makes and creates the male and female members of the human couple and blessing them. He named them with one name, Adam. The man acted improperly when he named his wife. It was an act, well, how was he feeling? God had just put a curse on the ground because of him. He had just accused God. What kind of mood was he in? What do you think he's doing when he names her Eve in 320? Do you think this is a good thing? Everything leads up to the fact, or to the idea, to the impression, to the anticipation that this is not going to be a good thing. It's the one act that we hear of him doing. It's the only thing left. And this rebel, how is he going to act? Page 277, Dr. Joy Fleming says this: it was an act that was inappropriate and evidenced his hostility toward God and his wife. He was contradicting God's name for her, an act of defiance toward God. Naming his wife also separated the two of them and distanced him from her. Well, the name he gave showed the man of death's hostility for the mother of all living. After all, God's words just spoken to him included a curse and not a blessing. God had also spoken to him about death, explaining that he would turn back to dust. By contrast, God had spoken to his wife about life, mentioning children and multiplied conceptions. Furthermore, God's words to the serpent favored the woman, for God had given a promise through her seed, not their seed. As soon as the speeches in 3:14 to 19 end, the next recorded event is the man speaking up. Contradicting the name God had given to him and her together, the man names her a different name, defiantly challenging God and fulfilling the prophetic warning of God in 3:16b to the woman. He will rule over her by giving her a name. In the process, he presumes as well to treat his wife as he had treated the animals in 2:20. God was the creator of the man and of the woman. He commanded them as their ruler. God had created, blessed, and instructed both the male and female made in his image to multiply and rule over the animals, 126, 128. But instead of ruling over them, his assigned domain, with his companion and counterpart in a legitimate rulership, he subsumes her into a new domain that he himself will govern. His first recorded act after God's speeches in 3:14 to 19 is the assertive and demonstrative act of the rebellious man to make his partner his own subject and to make himself her new ruler. His will, his desire is to govern her. God had spoken of the woman being a mother in 3:15 and 16. Verse 20 is the only written record of the man's commentary on God's speeches. His choice of name correctly describes her as mother of all humanity descended from himself. What about her? Well, the woman's thoughts regarding God's words are given expression in 4:1. She conceives and gives birth to a child following sexual relations with the man. Nonetheless, it is not to the man that she gives praise or credit, but rather to the Lord. Thanks and credit go to him, for it was Yahweh God who had promised to multiply her and had spoken of her giving birth to children in 3:16. In 4:1, she becomes pregnant and gives birth to a man-child. She responds with a 3-word speech: I produced a man with the Lord. There is a variation in how you can translate this from the Hebrew to the English. The translation depends on whether you have a direct object marker in here or a word that indicates the preposition with. In the first case, you would have, I have gotten a man, comma, the Lord. In the second case, it would mean, I've gotten a man with the Lord. In the first case, she might have, in faith, though incorrectly, believed her male child to be Yahweh himself, presuming that he was the promised seed of 3:15. In the second case, she would have been recognizing that it was Yahweh who was fulfilling his words to her in 3:16 of multiplied conceptions. Either of these is possible grammatically. Translating the word eth in Hebrew as the preposition with, Eve's speech would indicate that she believed in Yahweh God's words to her and acknowledged Yahweh rather than her husband as the one deserving credit and praise for the blessing of her first child. I remember when Dr. Walter Kaiser taught this in a class that I was taking, and he said, we actually have an echo or a foreshadowing of what's going to happen with, well, it won't be Eve, but it will be Mary. And Mary begets a child, the Lord. We have all this in between, but Eve would know about all these generations coming in between. The word seed or the word conception are singular, but they contain the plural content. There's the possibility of all kinds of generations in between. But you go from Eve to Mary, and you beget the Lord. And he thought that Eve was saying, well, this is it. Here's the promised seed. Here's the conqueror who's going to crush Satan's head. Either way, we have faith illustrated by Eve's words. We have continued rebellion illustrated by Adam's words. Page 279, and we're coming close to the section I want to read to you. This is from the doctoral dissertation. In section B of part 3, verse 21, God acts in regard to both the man and the woman, asserting his power in provision for their need. You see the love? Despite rebellious acts, he makes garments of skin to replace the silly fig leaves they've sewn together, and he clothes them. And in the Hebrew words, there's a play on the words. In the pristine state of the garden, in 2:25, the husband and the wife were naked and not ashamed. And now God acts to clothe them in 3:21, and you can hear sort of similar sounds in those two words, ashamed and clothed. Yahweh Elohim's words are found in section C in verse 22. That verse is made up of 4 lines. The first and last are short. The 2 middle lines are the longest of all of part 3. The expression good and evil was used several times already in the story of 2:9, 17, 3:5. Yahweh Elohim's words, interestingly, employ the terminology of the serpent. The serpent had changed the noun knowledge in the name of the tree to the verb to know in his contradiction of what Yahweh Elohim had said would happen if they ate. After the man and the woman disobeyed God's command, God did instruct them in his speeches of 3:14 to 19 so that they would know, like God did, what life would be now like with death and what the world created good by God would be like now with evil. Even some of the literary structures of those speeches served as a pedagogical tool to teach about good and evil juxtaposed in the world, banging against each other, confronting each other, clashing, permeating their lives until the grave. God had created them in the world good. choosing not to recognize their Creator's obvious claim upon them as their sovereign ruler. They had rebelled, themselves defining what was quote unquote good and bad for them to do. Did the two prophecies of the serpent ever come true? That the man's and the woman's eyes would be opened and that they would become like God? The ones to judge if their eyes were opened were the man and the woman himself. The one to judge if they became like God was God himself. The prophecies had, at best, only an ironic fulfillment. For if their eyes had been opened, it had resulted in their shame at what they saw they were. As for their becoming like God to know good and evil after eating, in 3:6, oh, they had run from God and had to be brought to account and instructed by him. Only after he conveyed such knowledge to them could God say that the man had become like God in knowing good and evil. When God breathes the breath of life into the man's nostrils, we have that echo from 2:7, and it comes back here now at the end of chapter 3. And so that the man may not partake of the tree of life too, God will act in verse 23 to prevent this. The second long line of God's words in section C contain two verbs already related to each other through perisonancy. Each verb, they sound alike. Each verb will be found again in the next verse in verse 23. The final line of God's words explains what would happen should the man eat from this tree too. He would immortalize his own state of good and evil. How do you get salvation for a man who is eternally evil? You can't have that. Death has to happen. So lest the man take and eat, God acts in section B prime of this part, verse 23. The two verbs of section C are found at the beginning and near the end of verse 23. God shows himself in control as he acts in regard to the man, anticipating his actions. Lest the man send out his hand, Yahweh Elohim sends out the man from the garden. And lest the man take from the second tree, he will work the ground outside of the garden from which he was taken. The verb in 3:22 and 23 recalls the opening episode of the story in 2:15 when Yahweh Elohim took the man and led him into the garden. There, his assignments were to work it and to guard it. However, an alien element had penetrated the garden, which the guardian did not chase out. The woman and the man had both been corrupted by that alien influence and had chosen to disobey God. No longer is the guardian fit for his task. He's an alien and an evil influence in the garden himself. He will still work the ground, but it will be outside of Eden. God chases out the old guardian, and he stations angels and a flaming sword as guardians to prevent him from reaching the tree of life. In episode A, the man entered the garden in 2:8, where he became the garden's cultivator and guardian. In episode A prime, he exits from Eden, sent out by God to be a cultivator of the ground outside of Eden, where he had been made and where he will die. He is banished, and new guards will prevent the human race from living forever in this condition of good and evil. Well, there follows an excursus in the dissertation. I hope you'll get it if you don't have it yet. You can contact me at Bruce at Tru316.com, Tru316.com, and we'll figure out a way for you to be able to get that. Well, thank you for thinking again about Genesis 3:16 with me. I have been reading to you in detail from the doctoral dissertation by Dr. Joy Fleming entitled A Rhetorical Analysis of Genesis 2 and 3 with Implications for a Theology of Man and Woman. What the Bible does say, what the Bible does not say. We need to think again about these things. It can be applied to our life. And the bad things that it says we need to take into account. The bad things we thought it said need to be cleaned out of our thoughts. And I hope you will help me as we try to clean them out of other people's thoughts. We need to get the true meaning, the technical sense, the actual meaning of Genesis 3:16. We need to get it out to the world, get it out to the translators that are translating these verses into other languages around the world. Make sure it's done properly. That's my prayer. I hope it's your challenge and you'll join me too. Thank you very much.